not going to do justice by it before I must leave town. We have the class today and the class next Wednesday morning, and then that will be the conclusion of our study this session. And we'll be taking up where we left off next March in the First Corinthian letter. We're spending a great deal of time in First Corinthians, but I know of no book in the New Testament that gives the basics of New Testament Christianity in a more pronounced way than First Corinthians. The congregation is having problems, doctrinal problems. First Corinthians is the book to study. If there are internal problems between members of the church of a personal nature, First Corinthians is the book to study. There are others that should be joined to it, but it again is the book to study. It is as up to date as any book in the New Testament and establishes, as well as any book in the New Testament, the fundamentals and the foundations upon which Christianity rests. I believe it's one of the most needed studies in the Church of our Lord today. And so we are spending a great deal of time in the book and studying some of these questions and subjects that are so pertinent to our age quite thoroughly, and I hope as thoroughly as they demand, and receiving from that study, I trust, that which is beneficial to all of us. Just about every subject of a doctrinal matter that you can think of is dealt one way or another in the First Corinthian epistle. But the 7th chapter has long been a battleground in the church and out of the church. It is becoming a great battleground for discussion in the church today. And again, we'll not be able to complete the study in 1 Corinthians 7 before I'll be leaving town. Let me repeat for the benefit of those who came in that the study today and next Wednesday morning will be the last study in the 1 Corinthian letter of this session. And we'll begin the study anew next March. I'd like to read the entire chapter, first of all. I know it's somewhat lengthy reading, but a lot of the understanding that we are to receive from studying various verses in this chapter are dependent upon an understanding of the chapter as a whole, or this section as a whole. Paul, as you no doubt well know, was giving answer here to certain things that they had questioned him concerning in a letter that they wrote to him. And he makes mention of that in the very first verse, and his deliberations then in the rest of this chapter, and of course it wasn't a chapter division at the time that Paul wrote it, but in this section, and the section is contained in this chapter, that which Paul writes in this section or this chapter is in answer to the questions that they asked in a letter to him. He says, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. Likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. But I speak this by permission, and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband, but and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? But as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk. And so ordain I in all churches. Is any man called, being uncircumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called, being a servant? Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's freeman. Likewise also he that is called, being free, is Christ's servant. Ye are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. Brethren, let every man, wherein he is called, therein abide with God. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord. Yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoiced not, and they that buy as though they possessed not, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. There is a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. But if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. So then, he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better. The wife is bound by the law as long as the husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. But if she is happier, if she so abide after my judgment, I think also that I have the Spirit of God. Now you talk about a passage of Scripture that's just fraught with difficulties and problems. This is it. And I've lost all my notes that I was preparing on this, and had prepared even before on this, and added to in connection with this, somewhere in the moving, or the packing for moving, and all the things. As a matter of fact, if you came over to my house, you'd have to tread lightly, because there are boxes that are lined all over the floor, and almost up to the ceiling and everywhere else. And so it's hard to find anything and know where what we want may be at the particular time. But I lost the notes that I had on this chapter, and in those notes I had listed some of the problems that we encounter today addition to the problems that Paul encountered in the day that he wrote this epistle, but some of the problems that we encounter today in connection with this epistle. And I'll try to recall some of them from memory, and I wish I had the notes that I'd made along that, because I went in detail in regard to it according to each individual verse. But just calling from memory some of the problems that we face today. The problem of celibacy. There are those who today say that celibacy is far better than marriage, that the celibate is able to devote himself to the things of God, whereas the one that's married is not so dedicated to the Lord. So celibacy is the better way of life. And of course, they had the celibates in Paul's day and time, even as we have them today, or those who advocated such as that. Another problem that we face today that possibly Paul did not face at the time that he wrote this epistle, though he in some respects had challenges in regard to his apostleship. This particular line of challenge was probably not in Paul's day as it is today. But we have some who say, well, Paul was not speaking by inspiration of God in that which he wrote here. Now, you have two different schools, I guess, in regard to this. Some who say, well, he was speaking by inspiration of the Lord in regard to other areas of the epistle, but he's not speaking by inspiration of the Lord in this particular chapter. And they seize upon such passages as verse 10, I command, yet not I, but the Lord. And then verse 12, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. And then he'll say, I speak this by permission and not of commandment in verse 6. And you can go on and on through the epistle, like verse 26, I suppose that such and such is good. And they say, well, Paul was not here speaking by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. He's not speaking with apostolic authority. And some who will seize upon this passage of Scripture to deny all inspiration on the part of the Apostle Paul. And it's been a battleground from that standpoint. You have others who have seized upon, and I'm not taking them in order by any means, but as they come to my mind in a recall situation, you have others who have seized upon the latter part of these verses, or the latter part of the chapter, to teach that a father can promiscuously misbehave with his child, his daughter. And I've had many counseling sessions in regard to that with members of the church, mothers who have brought their daughter before me and tried to get maybe the father to come. Sometimes the father has come, or maybe a daughter comes before me in regard to her father, and sometimes the father will be there, who has exercised, according to the verses in the latter part of this chapter, his prerogative or his power in regard to his virgin daughter, and where he has a relationship with her, because Paul said that's all right. And so that's another problem that we have faced today, if you can believe it. And you better believe it because it exists. You have others who have called upon this passage of Scripture to teach that there is another means for putting away a wife or a husband, another recognized means for putting away a husband or a wife than simply the cause of fornication, as stated by the Lord in Matthew 5 and 19 and other passages. That if one is married to an unbeliever and that unbeliever departs, well then you're not under bondage, and so you're free to remarry. That gives you another basis for putting away a spouse, a mate, for the purpose of remarriage. That has come recently out of this passage of Scripture. Others have seen, we can spend the whole hour this morning, or 2 hours, or whatever it might be, just discussing some of the modern day problems in the church that come into focus from this passage of Scripture. There are others who say, well, seizing upon about verse 18 on down through verse 24, that you can abide in any calling wherein you've been called. For example, if you've been married 15 times before you became a child of God. When you became a child of God, then you remain in whatever state that you were last at the time that you received the call by the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that you wouldn't have to put away, for example, the last mate with whom you were supposedly married, because you abide in the calling wherewith you've been called. And let's see, I know there are others. There are others, but I can't recall them at the present time. Maybe you think of another. And if you want to voice it, well, we'll be giving consideration to that as well. But it's amazing that so many problems, even to the dividing of the church, members between themselves in the church, have come out of one passage of Scripture. I think one thing that we need to do is keep in consideration the background for this discussion, what existed there at Corinth, and that with which Paul was dealing at the time that this teaching was given. Sometimes we lose sight of the context or the setting of the chapter. Well, let's go back to verse 1 then, if there are no preliminary thoughts to be given or other questions to be voiced in connection with this 7th chapter. He said, "Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, we do not have a record, or we do not have this letter that Paul received from the church at Corinth. It has been lost for all practical purposes with passage of time. But Paul states, I received a letter from you, and now I'm writing in answer to that letter." Of course, he was writing, first of all, chapters 1 through 4, to meet the problems that existed there at Corinth in connection with division. He said, I've heard about that division that exists among you from the house of Chloe. It's been reported unto me. So Paul immediately took up pen to write unto them in connection with that division. Now, in connection with that, he also takes the time then to answer these questions that they had concerning marriage, everything centering around the subject of marriage. I don't believe that we are to interpret, as others have, that this is not as serious a matter or worthy of discussion as the other matters with which he dealt in this epistle to the church of Corinth. Some of the reasoning that has been advanced is on this order. Well, Paul didn't take time to write a letter to them in regard to the questions that they had asked about marriage, but when he heard about some of the other things that existed there at Corinth, well, he immediately wrote them concerning that, because that was more important than this. I don't believe that that assumption or that conclusion is warranted. He simply puts the two of them together. How long it had been since he had received the letter from them, no one knows. It would be presumptuous on our part to try and express. He simply, in the same letter, took the opportunity to give answer to the questions that they had asked. Maybe he had received the letter from them at the very time that he was writing concerning the problem that he had heard from the house of Chloe that existed among them. Who knows? But I don't think we can assume that this is of lesser importance than the other things with which he dealt in the church at Corinth, and so we shouldn't be too concerned with it. I'm going to answer, he says, the things whereof ye wrote unto me. Now, he deals with a number of questions or problems there at Corinth. This is peculiar to a great extent to Corinth, although the principles that he here sets forth are applicable in every day and age and to every congregation of the Lord's saints everywhere. But first of all, he deals with the rights and the obligations of marriage. And that's in verses 1 through 7. The rights and the obligations of marriage. There'll be other places in this epistle where he's going to give further teaching along that line. But this is the first thing with which he deals, the rights and the obligations of marriage, verses 1 through 7. In verses 1 and 2 specifically, he deals evidently with the question of should Christians marry at all? Evidently, there were some who there were of the celibate idea, or ascetics, a very strong group in the world, both religious world and civil world in Paul's day, the ascetics, who said, well, a man should not marry at all. It's better not to marry. Matter of fact, the Essenes, those of you who have been in the Tuesday night study, know that that was one of the things that the Essenes, a very strong, and I'm using that in a relative sense, a strong religious group or sect in the Jewish religion. They downgraded marriage. They said man shouldn't be married. Some of them said that it's a necessary evil, and it's better not to. And so Paul deals with that first of all, advice to those who think that you shouldn't marry at all. And then verses 3 through 7, his advice to those who urge that even if you are married, you ought to abstain from all sexual relationships with each other. And we've got, of course, their counterparts today, even as that existed in Paul's day and time. In light of Corinth, some possibly, and I'm making an assumption here, but an assumption that's based on Paul's writing, some at Corinth could possibly have become so disillusioned and disgusted at what was being seen in sexual promiscuousness in Corinth that they went to the other extreme. You just shouldn't have any sex at all. It's evil. Matter of fact, we find a great many secular writings in Paul's day and time of speaking, writings that spoke rather of sexual relationships in the marriage bond being an evil. It should not be. And some of them carrying this step further and say, well, it's a necessary evil, I guess, because you can't do too much about it because of the drives that are within men and women, but that it was evil. Well, Paul deals with that in this first section. In verses 8 and 9, he then gives advice to the unmarried, and he embraces in that the widows. What about the ones that are not married? Should they never get married again? Verses 10 and 11, those who thought that the married ones, after becoming Christian, ought to separate from one another. Or Christian, non-Christian. But when you became a Christian, then you ought to devote yourself to higher things and should not marry at all. Or should separate, rather. He evidently deals with that problem, and that problem did exist in Paul's day. The Essenes, for example, again would have an influence upon the ones who became Christians, and the Essenes said, well, if you've been married, now you should leave that partner and devote yourself to more godly things, and they lived in communities that were free of women. For the most part, there were exceptions to that. All right, in verses 12 through 17, he gives advice to those who think that a marriage ought to be dissolved if the Christian is married to a non-Christian. Well, there would be much basis for that belief in that the teaching of the Old Testament demanded that. And the teaching of both the Old and the New Testament is that a Christian should not marry a non-Christian. So, should the marriage be dissolved if a Christian is married to a non-Christian? Paul gives advice along that line in verses 12 through 17. In verses 18 through 24, we have to some extent the Pauline digression. You know, I said Paul gets to a certain point and he is discussing a subject or a word, and then he digresses for a moment and goes into another similar discussion and then comes back to that original point of word. Well, we see that Pauline departure or digression to some extent in verses 18 through 24, where he gives advice to the Corinthians to live the Christian life in whatever state they may happen to find themselves to be in. Whatever state you're in, continue to live the Christian life. Serve the Lord. In verses 25 through 38, he gives advice concerning virgins, especially virgin daughters, and the responsibility that a father has in regard to his virgin daughter. And the fact that nothing should interfere with our consecration to Christ. Verses 39 and 40 then, he gives advice to those who wish to remarry. Again, let me emphasize, Paul is dealing with problems that existed there at Corinth, especially in the church at Corinth. We certainly have counterparts today, and the principles, even the commandments that he gives, are commandments and principles that apply to us today. But we shouldn't lose sight of the problems that existed, particularly there at Corinth. All right, you wrote unto me. I'm giving answer. And here's the advice, as we've broken it down in the chapter. Here's the advice that he's giving to them in regard to things that they evidently had asked about or expressed a concern about. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. Our first problem immediately arises in regard to the word good. And there have been page after page after page written in various commentaries and reference works as to what Paul had in mind or what he is expressing in regard to the word good. Well, let's look at the word good in light of its context. I grant you that the term good is quite often used accommodatively. Basically, by basic etymology, the basic root meaning of the word good is God ordained or God ordered. Now, is Paul saying it is God ordained, it is God ordered that a man not touch a woman? Well, before we answer that, let's look just for a moment at the word touch, so we don't have a misunderstanding of what we're talking about, or at least what Paul's talking about. The word touch is a euphemism, a substitute word. We have many euphemisms, for example, that I think should not be used, substitute words. They're substitute for swearing. We say darn, which is a substitute for goddamn. We say well, I won't get into all of it. Anyway, we have a lot of euphemisms that are floating around today, most of which I think should not be used by a Christian because they're simply substitute swearing for the most part. And we have other euphemisms that would be, of course, quite in order that might be used today. We don't say generally, well, so-and-so, talking to a woman possibly lost her husband. Oh, he died, huh? We say he passed away, or words like that. They're euphemisms. They're substitutes for what word would commonly or normally be used to soften the word to some extent, or soften the idea embraced in that word and make them more palatable or acceptable to us. The word touch is a euphemism, and it's used throughout the Bible as a substitute for a word that could be used, but this makes the idea a little more palatable to us, especially in mixed company, a little more agreeable to our senses. And though Paul and the other New Testament writers and Old Testament writers were not too hesitant to express themselves very candidly and vividly in regard to most ideas, still you do find euphemisms being used throughout the Bible. Touch is one. Look at Genesis, for example, the 20th chapter. And verse 6. This is Abraham and his wife Sarah, very pretty woman evidently, and Abimelech the king. Abraham was frightened that in going into the area that men would see how beautiful Sarah was and then put him to death and take Sarah away from him. And so he told Sarah to say that she was his sister, you recall. And she was a half-sister, but it was a lie. And so look at verse 2. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, thou art but a dead man. For the woman which thou hast taken, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. And then verse 6. And God said unto him in a dream, yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. And what's he talking about? Having a physical, sexual relationship with Sarah. God stopped any actions along that line because Abimelech was sincere in the matter. He didn't know that she was Abraham's wife. God stopped him from sinning against him and kept Abimelech from getting killed in the matter. And when Abimelech found out that she was Abraham's wife, well then of course he sent her back to Abraham and said, what are you trying to do to me? Trying to get me killed? And he would not have anything to do with her from a physical or sexual standpoint. The 26th chapter of Genesis and verse 11. And Abimelech charged all his people, saying, he that toucheth this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. Now this is not Abraham, this is Isaac, his son. Isaac did the same thing. He had a beautiful woman for a wife, and he was fearful for his own life, in that a man might desire and kill him to take her unto himself. But Abimelech says, don't you touch him or her. In other words, no woman is to touch him, no man is to touch her. They are husband and wife. Proverbs, the 6th chapter, and verse 29. So he that goeth into his neighbor's wife, whosoever toucheth her, shall not be innocent. That's talking about, of course, physical relationships, sexual relationships. So it's a euphemism for a physical sexual relationship. I started using another word, and I decided not to. Now, is he saying it is good, it is God ordained, it is God ordered not for a man not to have a physical sexual relationship with a woman? So what he's saying? Well, if that be so, except for what he counters with in the next few verses, he's saying something that God said the very opposite concerning. Matter of fact, in the very beginning of time, Genesis 2 and verse 18, God saw that it was not good for man to live alone, and he gave to man a woman. God said it is good for a man to have a woman and to have the physical relationship that exists between a man and a woman. Now, some would counter, well, in the next few verses, he alters this to show that he's speaking of good in one area. Others say, well, he's talking about marriage, but he's talking about marriage in light of the present distress. For example, in verse 8, he uses this word good again. I say, therefore, to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. You mean it is good, it's God ordained, it is God ordered that the unmarried not get married? Is that what he said? Well, that violates what the Lord said in the very beginning of time in other passages of Scripture as well. Look at verse 26, where the term good is again used in its context, this context. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. Now, most would interpret the word good in light of verse 26. Paul says that it is good, it's God ordained, God ordered, in light of the present distress. What is the present distress? Well, when was this epistle written? Yes, for the fall of Jerusalem, more specifically when? What date? 57 A.D. Who was the emperor at that time? You've got it at the back of your... Who was the emperor? Anyone recall? Nero. Nero brought one of the worst persecutions against the church known in the history of men. It must be that present distress, and Paul is discussing all through this particular chapter, that present distress. It's going to be better that a woman not have a husband. It's going to be better that a husband not have a wife for this present distress. You're going to be under persecution. And unless some of the remarks made by Paul are interpreted in light of verse 26, they're going to be very, very difficult to understand, because it puts Paul's teaching at variance with the Lord's. And we know that cannot be, because he spoke by the Spirit of the Lord. Now let's go back to verse 1. It is good. God ordained, God ordered. Basic etymology of the word. Now, is it used in that way, or is it used accommodatively? Meaning, well, I think it's good. I think it will. I think it's satisfactory. Again, in light of the present distress, that a man not have a physical relationship with a woman. Most would say not to touch a woman has reference to a man getting married. It is good, it's well, it's fine in light of the present distress that a man not marry. Have that physical relationship that exists between a man and a woman. Now, personally, I cannot agree to that line of reasoning. I think the word good is as the word good, by basic meaning, comes across to us, or according to its basic etymology, is meant to be accepted. It is good, it's God ordained, it's God ordered for man not to touch, have a physical relationship, and the word that I started to use before, an affair with a woman. But to avoid fornication. The good is to be interpreted, or the touch is to be interpreted in light of fornication. Now I think you've got something that's harmonious to the very context, the immediate context of his discussion. It is God ordained. It is God ordered that a man not have a physical relationship with a woman unless, as he's saying in verses 2 on, unless it's in the marriage relationship. And now it's not only harmonious to the immediate context, it's harmonious to the entire writing of the New Testament and Old Testament. Paul is not disparaging marriage. And he has been accused of that a great many times. Verse 1. Those who interpret it as marriage. It's good for a man not to be married. Say, well, Paul was disparaging marriage. Verse 8. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them. God ordained, God's ordered for them, if they abide even as I, be unmarried. And they come across saying, well, Paul is disparaging marriage. Paul didn't like marriage. Paul was against marriage. Paul didn't like women. Matter of fact, your ERA, your feminists of today, seize upon this regularly to show that Paul hated women. We had a member of the church here from whom we had to withdraw fellowship. We got caught up in the ERA movement. And in trying to talk to her over a long period of time, one thing that she said everybody knows about the Apostle Paul, he hated women. Everything that he wrote in his epistle in regard to women was out of the hatred that he had for them. And then went on further, said all the Jews were like that. They had a complete misconception of woman and a downgrading of woman, and it's reflected in the writings of the Bible. Vehement in regard to it. Hatred coming to the surface and seething and boiling forth. Well, as I tried to tell her, if you'll go back into history, secular history, you'll find that where the Bible's gone, woman's role in the world has been elevated, not disparaged. And we, of course, went into many studies, but it didn't do any good. But Paul's not disparaging marriage. In Ephesians, the 5th chapter, for example, verses 22 through 33, Paul gave a beautiful presentation of marriage and its sanctity and its holiness and its goodness, even likening the relationship that existed between Christ and his church to that beautiful relationship. And that would have to be the analogy, the beautiful relationship that exists between a husband and his wife. Paul wasn't disparaging marriage. He certainly wouldn't, by the Spirit of the Lord, of course that's challenged by others, but he certainly wouldn't, by the Spirit of the Lord, offset what the Lord had said in the very beginning of time, Genesis 2:18, it's not good for man to live alone. And because of that recognition, God created for man a help that was meet or worthy for him, and ordained in the very beginning the marriage relationship. Now, Paul wouldn't, by the Lord's Spirit, deny that teaching. Not only that, if you turn over to 1 Timothy, the 4th chapter, And verse 3 specifically, Paul in verses 1 through 3 is talking about they that in latter times shall depart from the faith, depart from the teaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the faith. He says they'll give heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. They'll speak lies and hypocrisy. They have their conscience seared with a hot iron. What's one expression of it? Forbidding to marry. I mean, Paul's going to put himself in the very same classification of that which he so vehemently condemns in this passage of Scripture? Well, of course not. And as you read the entire chapter, you see Paul's not discouraging marriage at all. Matter of fact, in the next few verses, he talks about marriage. In verses 2 through 7. He talks about marriage. That's what I'm talking about in connection with that. To avoid all forms of immorality, marry. This is the way God has ordained it. Now, let's come to another idea. One purpose of marriage, therefore, according to this passage of Scripture, it's not the only purpose for marriage, but in light of what Paul is here discussing, one purpose for marriage is the physical relationship that exists naturally between man and woman and the fulfilling of our sexual desires. The Roman Catholic Church, for example, has long taught that the fulfilling of sexual desires, even in the marriage state, is sinful unless it's for one purpose only, and that's for the procreation of the race. And so if in the marriage relationship there is a physical, sexual relationship between the man and the woman, I say even in the marriage state, if that physical, sexual relationship exists for some purpose other than to have a child and propagate the race, then that's a sin that has to be confessed in the confessional unto the priest. Huh? Well, yeah, there are. I tell you, when I worked in Italy among the Catholics, it was truly pathetic along this line. It was pathetic. They were caught up in a vice that wasn't their own devising, but the devising of unholy men and an unholy system that it just destroyed them. And that's why most Catholics in your Catholic-dominated country are Catholics in name only. They can't cope with the inequities that exist in a system that's untenable. The confessional, for example. Every man, generally, with whom you had concourse in Italy, would say, the confessional's for the woman. Meaning by that's... No, it meant something else. It meant, how can I put it delicately? That's where the priest got his kicks. And the woman sometimes got hers. That's not good language, but maybe that gets the idea across. In the tete-a-tete, in the discussion, that's for the woman. In other words, they aren't interested in the man coming in there and confessing about it. They're interested in the woman coming in there and confessing about it. Oh, yes. There are a lot of things that are in that beyond that, but that's true. Yeah. And then the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church that you cannot have joy in sex. Of course, that has been carried over even into the Protestant world, and sometimes into the church, but you can't have joy in sex. And that's unholy, and that's contrary to God. In talking with men intimately in Italy, for example, it'd say, now, you mean to tell me that you, a good Catholic, do not have any enjoyment? No, I don't. The only reason you have sex with your wife is in order to bring forth a child. That's right. You don't have any enjoyment on it, because if you have enjoyment on it, you've got to confess that. That's a sin. Well, I don't know about that. But anyway, it's a sin. You have to confess it. Now, you can imagine what develops out of it. Here's a woman who is a sincere Catholic. And I mean sincere. And she goes to a priest and she said, Father, and it's embarrassing. Father, I enjoyed the sexual relationship that I had with my husband last night. Oh, you did? Well, now tell me about it. And you can see what develops in regard to that. And I know what I'm talking about because I've got the very questions that the priest asks in the confessional. I've got it. And I also know because we converted many priests and archpriests during our work in Italy. We don't have the archpriests here in the United States, but in Italy and France, for example, they have an archpriest between the priest and the bishop. But we converted many of them, and they told us freely about what went on and why. There's a purpose behind it, but it's completely unnatural. It's contradictory to what the Bible teaches, and it catches the people up in a vice, something that they can't cope with. They got the system of religious life that's saying something to them that's entirely contradictory to nature and every rationale of man. And yet they try to hold on to it, and finally they just recognize there's no way, and they see that the ones who are teaching them that that's the way it must be are practicing the very opposite, and so they just are Catholics in name and not in true belief. They've been caught up into a system. One purpose for marriage is to have the physical, sexual gratification that's been placed within man and woman, that desire that's been placed within man and woman by God. You don't have fornication, or you don't seek fornication to have a child. There are exceptions to all rules. But men don't go out and commit fornication with a woman or with women for the purpose of having children. Women don't commit fornication with men for the purpose of having children. They commit fornication for the purpose of enjoying the sexual relationship. And he says, now, lest it be there, put it in marriage. That's what he's saying. And he's talking about marriage is for that purpose. You have the same teaching by the Apostle Paul, if he is the writer, and undoubtedly he is, of the Hebrew letter. Hebrews, the 13th chapter. The first part of the 13th chapter, verse 4, is quoted repeatedly in our marriage ceremonies. Very seldom is the latter part of the verse quoted in our marriage ceremonies. But it says marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. But whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. Well, why do you have whoremongering? Why do you have adultery? For the bearing of children? Well, to ask the question is rhetorical, is to answer it. You have whoredom, or you have adultery for the purpose of sexual gratification, enjoyment. And he says, in the bed that's undefiled, in the bed of marriage, it is undefiled. So that's one purpose of marriage. How many are getting cold? One. Okay, how about my coat? Now, as stated, this is but one reason for marriage. It's not the only reason. Companionship is another reason. Supplementing of abilities is another reason. There are certain things that the woman can do far better than the man. There are certain things that the man can do far better than the woman. Notwithstanding the feminist arguments of today. Let me deviate just for a second. I get so absolutely sick at these. I love sports and I love contests, and I'm competitive, and I eat that up. But I get so sick of these battles between the sexes that are put on, and here a man tennis player is playing a woman tennis player, and the woman tennis player beats the man. They say, "How's it feel to be beaten by a woman?" and so forth, you know. And here the man is playing double court, and the woman's playing single court. And the man has one serve, and the woman has two serves. And it's the most unfair. Virtually, I could beat the man myself, and I haven't played tennis in 30 years on such a court as that. But they make it completely unfair, and then they talk about the equality of the sexes, and that's what gets me. The sexes are not equal. God never intended them to be equal from a physical standpoint. The man's body is built in a certain way to accomplish certain things. The woman's body is built in certain ways. She told me she had to leave early. She wasn't getting mad. Was built in a certain way to accomplish certain things. Man has a muscle or a frame with muscles that enables him to lift heavy loads, not the woman. She's able to do delicate work, generally speaking, better than the man. There are exceptions to all rules. But they're not equal. And this idea of making an equality between the sexes from any standpoint is contradictory to nature and to the teachings of God. And I get a little upset with it. I don't think that I'm a chauvinist, and a chauvinist, but one generally that's a chauvinist is the one who is a feminist. Because chauvinism, if I were ever on one of these television programs, they'd start talking about the male chauvinist. I think I would latch onto that real quick. Do you know the meaning of chauvinism? What's the definition of chauvinism? You've been throwing around a word here, and I'd like you to define the word. What's the meaning of it? Chauvinism is giving an undue emphasis to sex, or to the sexes. And who gives the undue emphasis? Generally, it's the feminists who's calling everybody else the chauvinists. They're the ones who are caught up in it and giving an undue emphasis or stress upon it and making it something bigger than it actually should be. But the woman has abilities, certain abilities that are peculiar to womanhood that she's able to fulfill in the needs of a home. And the man has certain abilities that are peculiar to his manhood, but he's able to give in the home, and they complement one another, meeting the needs for a home. That's what it's been ordained by God. So, one reason for marriage is companionship. Another reason for marriage is sexual gratification. Another reason for marriage is compatibility, or meeting the needs of a home that can be supplied by the woman's abilities and supplied by the man's abilities that are peculiar to womanhood and manhood. And then, of course, another reason for the home is for the procreation of the race, for children to be brought into this world. Yes.
What were those people thinking of that said that they were against sex? How did they expect
Well, that was for them. Well, it was all right for Daddy and Mother. We were discussing that Tuesday night. You know, it's an incompatibility or incongruity there, contradiction there that I'm sure gave them a lot of problems with which they didn't want to deal with. Your daddy and your mother had to bring you into this world, and now you're saying that such as that is evil. And so many of them said, well, it's a necessary evil. That's how this idea came. It's a necessary evil, but now in devoting yourself, consecrating yourself to God, stay away from it. So after you've already been born, don't worry about bringing somebody else into the world. You just capitalize on having been born yourself, and then you devote yourself to holier things. Huh? Well, yeah, they didn't teach that, but I can appreciate what you're saying. Here are some of the reasons for marriage, therefore. Now, the one reason of which that he's here taking into consideration because of the specific need is to avoid fornications. Let every man, there are not certain men who are different from other men. This is for every man. There are not certain women who are different from other women. It's every woman. Let every man have his own wife, singular, not wives. And so, immediately he's contradicting, by the Spirit, the idea of polygamy. And let every woman have her own husband. And he's, again, condemning any polygamous action in marriage. It seems strange, but nevertheless that's been the history, and it isn't strange in one way, but it seems strange. The woman is more physically attuned to polygamous action than is the man. And yet the man is generally the polygamist. The woman has the physical ability along that line that the man does not have, but the man has the drives that the woman generally does not have. And so God has put counterbalances, I guess. Well, all right. We have counterbalances. Well, now, a woman is expressing herself, and if you were listening to a man, let me tell you, he would say just as pronouncedly, it's not fair speaking from the male standpoint. I believe that there are counterbalances. It would be, I'll put it, hellish world if man with the drives that he has had the ability that the woman has. Let me tell you, it wouldn't be a world safe or fit to live in. If the woman had the drives that the man has, and we're speaking generically, with the ability that she had, again, you couldn't live in this old world. That's all there is to it. There are counterbalances. And I guess both sexes can oftentimes feel, and speaking very candidly, feel that, I don't know how to put the, reverently I'm saying this, but as we naturally feel, both sexes feel sometimes imposed upon. Why? We may question, why did God make it this way? I guess all of us have at one time. I do. And I haven't talked to a man yet when letting his hair down, so to speak, but that hasn't expressed the same thing. And no women do as well. So from a natural human standpoint, I guess all of us question in our own mind certain things that are, but we don't know everything, and God does, and so that's why it is. And we rely on faith, by faith, on what has been developed or brought into the world by God. But I do see the advantages of the counterbalance. That I understand completely. But every man have his own wife. Has been the history of man almost from the beginning of time to take unto himself more than one wife. But that's not according to the law of God, either in the Old Testament or the New Testament. And every woman have her own husband. She doesn't have the disposition of man, generally, historically, to take unto herself many husbands. Maybe the framework of our society wouldn't allow it, but she doesn't have, seemingly, that disposition, though she might have the ability. But still, it's a woman with one man, and a man with one woman. That's the way it's been ordained by God. No, the man's allowed to have more than one wife. Mormon religion is strictly man-orientated. And your celestial marriages are based entirely upon the man's physical needs. The woman is not taken into consideration, really. And I wouldn't say that to a Mormon, but I would in a class like this, because if I was dealing with them, I wouldn't try to deal on the that aspect of their religion, but rather on meeting their doctrinal teachings. But it's strictly man, devoted to the man concept. Let the husband render unto a wife due benevolence. Benevolence, the King James has translated this adequately and correctly, although it has been assailed by a great many. Due, that which is due her, it's an obligation. Benevolence, what she has need of physically. Actually, there couldn't be any better translation of what the Greek says. But it's been assailed in recent years because they say, well, people don't understand what it's talking about. I think they do. All they have to do is just break down the two words, due. When a note's due, an obligation is there that has to be met. Benevolence, what is benevolence? Helping someone in physical need. And since he's talking about the sexual things relating to marriage, what's he talking about? He's talking about give her what is due her, what is your obligation to give to her in regard to her physical sexual needs. And likewise also the wife unto the husband. So again, there has to be compatibility there. The husband will generally, in most marriages, have a greater physical drive or need than the woman. And there are exceptions to that. And I have in years past. I try to stay out of counseling today as much as humanly possible. And I turn it all over to the elders, if at all possible. But I have counseled with literally thousands upon thousands of people in regard to this very thing. There needs to be teaching in the church. I think there has to be some limitations and some restrictions on it, but there needs to be teaching in the church along this line. The husband has an obligation to the wife. The wife has an obligation to the husband. Their drives, their needs are different. There are exceptions to all rules. Husbands and wives generally are quite incompatible according to their needs. I think it historically has been the major problem in marriage, money, and the next, sex. Sexual compatibility or incompatibility. Generally, they are incompatible in regard to their needs. The husband's drives generally are far greater than the wife's drives. And I could go into the physiology of it, and I don't think there's a need for that. And I imagine I have read and studied with doctors as many books and thoughts along this line as the average counselor. There is a change in woman at a certain age level, generally in life, where her needs will develop and get greater, and the man's will subside, and an incompatibility oftentimes develops that is contradictory to the former age or beginning of marriage. And then it changes again. And I'm not here to get into the physiology of it, but simply to say that generally speaking, there are different needs on the part of men and on the part of women. And a lot of problems develop within the marriage relationship as a result of that disparagency between man and woman and their physical sexual needs. Now, the husband is quite often prone to say, she is to do thus and so. And he generally is far more aggressive in these matters, and she far more reticent or accepting in these matters in the man-woman relationship. But whereas he can say she ought to do thus and so, she has as much right to say he ought to do thus and so. He has a responsibility to recognize her needs, which physically may not be as great as his. She has a responsibility of recognizing his needs, which, generally speaking, are greater than hers. And they meet a compatibility between two extremes. That's marriage. And both parties have to work at it. Well, I think that's enough. I think everything's understood. If it's not, well, you may ask questions, and I'll try to deal with it objectively and discreetly. But he's got to recognize her needs. He gives unto the wife her due benevolence. When she does not feel like a sexual expression, and he does, he's got to consider her as much as she is to consider him. Generally, the woman is demanded to consider him, and that's wrong. But she's also to consider him, but he's also demanded by God to consider her.
In years past, though, and this is just from what I hear, the wife was not considered to have many rights. As far as in this regard, she was just something for her husband.
Yes.
And the women were raised to be taught along that now.
That's exactly what I'm getting at.
But it's changed. Nowadays, of course, women are thinking for their own. And in the church, I don't know that that's ever really been discussed because in recent years, since I've only been in the church for recent years.
Well, I've been preaching for 35 years, and I have taught it every time we got to that point. I think I have many views in regard to that and don't want to be too expressive or outspoken in regard to it. I think some preachers in the Brotherhood have capitalized upon the fact that the Bible teaches very plainly and objectively along these lines to give them license for discussions that they may want to pursue. And I think that we have license to pursue those discussions and that they are to be pursued and teaching is to be given along the lines of the Bible in regard to these subjects, but as we naturally meet the discussion in what we're studying rather than creating the study. And I hope you understand what I'm saying about that. I get very upset with creating the subjects.
Well, if only women that are ERA would realize that the godly woman is so liberated, really.
Oh, yes.
So many rights.
Certainly. She doesn't know what she's talking about because she's never read the Bible. She's heard a bunch of lies. It's been thrown out. And I grant you there have been wrongs done the woman, generally speaking. Wrongs, grievous wrongs done the woman in the history of man and in the church and in Judaism. I wouldn't deny that for a moment. I wouldn't try to sugarcoat it or say it doesn't exist. Like an ostrich, hide your head in the sand. No, grievous wrongs have been done, but not because of the teaching of the Bible, because of man's misuse of biblical teaching or in his own waywardness in contradiction to what the Bible teaches. Now, there is a beautiful harmony taught in the Bible between man and woman if recognized both by man and woman. A blessed state, which I wish our feminists could understand, but they've been filled with a pack of lies that the Bible teaches what they've seen on the part of man's expression over the ages, and that's wrong. And in strictly man class, I'd be far more outspoken in regard to the man's responsibility than I would in a class like this. Maybe in an entire woman's class, I might be more outspoken on the woman's responsibility. So I think in a woman's class, I'd be more prone to speak about the man's responsibility along with hers, because I think she, generally speaking, has been done such an injustice by man. But in the man's class, I'd be very outspoken in man's responsibility, because I think man has been very lax to recognize the teaching of the Bible and his responsibility to the woman. And the Bible teaches compatibility between the two. There is incompatibility that must be made compatible. And that's by both of them recognizing the needs of one another. I take into consideration my wife, she takes into consideration her husband. And they try to fit a happy medium between two extremes. And whenever I demand more than she's capable of giving, I've made demands upon her that do not take into consideration her needs and is wrong, condemned by God. If she is unfulfilling to my needs, and that's the way it generally is, or if she's over-demanding, and I found that to be the case on many occasions, then it's the same thing, same principle. Yeah. They don't, but they should. That's right. That's absolutely true. And there's more embraced in it than just what I'm saying on the surface. And I know that you're well aware of it as a man or as a woman. The woman's drive is not as great, generally speaking, as the man. The drive she has to be met in a way that's peculiar to her, which is entirely different to the way that a man's drive, which is generally greater than the woman's, is to be met. Now, is that understandable to everyone? All right. Let me just embellish it with this idea. A woman needs tenderness, caressing, a lot of fair expression of love. The man is more like the animal, which is an immediate gratification. And those needs have to be considered by both the male and the female, and a compatibility arrived at. But it's shameful, it's pathetic, rather than shameful, but it's pathetic. How many problems we have in the church, as well as out of the church, but in the church, because ample teaching has not been given in this area. And all the ramification of that teaching that Paul is embracing here in due benevolence. What is her due, or her need, and what is his due, or his need, and that being made. Now, verse 4 amplifies it. The wife hath not power over her own, of her own body. All right, I like that. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. Jump to it. But wait a minute, there's another part to that verse. Another part to it. Also, and likewise also, the husband hath not power of his own body. Oh, that's not according to the history of man. He hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Just as much as I, as a man, macho, have power over the woman, she has the power over the man. As he's saying, you better get together and work things out that's compatible to both of you. That doesn't in any way detract from the fact that the husband is the head of the wife. If the husband is truly the head of the wife, as God has ordained headship, he will recognize the wife to have power over his own body, even as she is to recognize that he has power over her body. Headship doesn't mean, hey, you cower before me and you do what I say because I'm the boss and you're the slave. It doesn't mean that, not biblically. So that's the way it's been oft-time applied. Nor does that detract from the fact that he is the head. He rules that house. But the rule of that man over the house, over his wife, is the same type of a rule that Christ has over the church, which is a loving rule, a caring rule, a serving rule, but still a rule. He is responsible for the guidance, the direction, and the course of that house, for its standing or its fall. He is responsible. That doesn't mean that she's not responsible. He is the manager. He is the superintendent. But that superintendency or that managership or that headship does not alter the fact that she is to be made equal or compatible. I'm trying to find words that are right in every context. She being considered in a compatible situation with him in that marriage relationship. Defraud ye not one the other, and it is defraud. Do not take that which rightfully belongs to another. Don't rob, don't steal from the other. Except it be, now he's going to show a cause for not engaging in this sexual relationship that would normally be in the marriage relationship. He gives certain qualifications. You are stealing from one another. You are robbing the other. You're defrauding the other if you do not meet the needs of each other. Unless, now notice the restrictions, unless it be with consent, both parties have to be agreeable to it. Except it be for a time, it's seasonal. It's not for always. It's that you may give yourself to fasting is not in the original text, in your best manuscripts. But prayer is. And it has the definite article before it, the prayer, showing that it is, again, a specific thing that's in mind. And fourth, come together again. Before such a time that Satan can tempt you in your incontinency, and you're not fulfilling your sexual needs. That's going to vary. With a man, it could be 1 day, it could be 2 days, it could be 3 days, it might be 5 days, it might be 2 weeks. With a woman, it might be 1 day, but generally it might be longer than with a man. It might be 1 week, might be 2 weeks, might be 1 month, might be 2 months. I don't think generally it would be, but I'm just saying there again is that difference between the man and the woman. And now Satan has to be taken into consideration, let it be before there's any temptation put before one or the other in this meeting the needs of one or the other. So it's seasonal, and the season is dependent upon the individuals that are involved. A man and a woman sit down and discuss it. That's the only thing that I can think of in connection with it. Or if they don't discuss it, they know from years of living together, associating together, the rapport that they have together as a man and woman in a marriage relationship that, well, we can do thus and so, or not do thus and so. There's a particular, let me give an illustration. I wish I could give a couple illustrations, I won't though. But here's an illustration. Here's a child that's very, very sick. Your child. And the husband and wife, because of that particular situation, rather than thinking about sexual gratification, personal gratification, and personal needs, would rather spend the time in praying about the needs of that child and showing concern for the situation that exists than their own physical enjoyment. Just like you'll go without sleep when a child is ill. At other times, you may not go without sleep. You say, hey, I need my 8 hours. But when a child's ill, you might get 2 hours a night. Not the way you naturally do it? No. But we are ready to do it because of the need that exists there. That's an illustration of it. You know, maybe by your association one with another, hey, this is more important right now. We're going to give ourselves to this. You might sit down and discuss it. Let's wait a little while. But still, there is an agreement between the husband and wife. However it comes about, there's an agreement between the husband and wife. It's with consent. I'm agreeable to this. I'm agreeable to it. Okay. It's for a time. It's only for a limited period. It's not for always. If you'll pardon the personal expression, Peggy and I would have to have that every time that I go away on a meeting. And if the meetings got too many in number and what have you, there might be some kickback. Hey, let's put this off a little bit or what have you. But it's for a time. It's for the purpose that you give yourself, as he says here, to prayer, for particular spiritual work. But you come back together again, and you do it before such a time that Satan is tempting you, and that incontinency. I think, Brother Nichols, C.R. Nichols, Grand Old Man, he could get away with it. No one else could, unless they were of his age. But he was asked by some young preachers at a meeting that he was conducting in Dallas. Do you know C.R. Nichols? All right. You know, some of the older ones, pardon, some of the older ones, that includes me because I knew him well. But I knew him later in life when I was in college. There's C.R. Nichols, grand gospel preacher. I'd call him a pioneer and hard worker in the church, but in his later years in life, in Dallas in a meeting, some of the young preachers came up to him and they were discussing very same. One question that was asked was, well, Nichols, how long do you think a meeting ought to last? Well, of course, what was in mind was they used to be, and I used to hold 2-week meetings, 3 Sunday meetings. You can imagine that, start on a Sunday and go through 3 Sundays. And then they came down to 2.5 weeks. What we preachers would call 2 Sundays going through Wednesday or Thursday night, maybe Friday night. And then they came down to Sunday through Tuesday, and then they came down Sunday through Sunday, and then they came down Sunday through Friday, and then they came down Sunday through Thursday and through Wednesday, and now a lot of meetings are Sunday through Tuesday with the changing times. But anyway, that's what was in mind. How long, Brother Nichols, do you think that a meeting ought to last? And he snapped back real quick because he had a dry wit, and he also was quick-minded. He said, until the brethren's wives start looking good to you. Well, there's a lot of truth in that. As I said, at his age, he could get away with it very well. Someone younger might not get away with it quite as well. But a lot of truth in it. Lest Satan tempt you in your incontinency. There's a period of time there where other things may be entering into your mind. Come back together again. All right, we'll have to end there. We've gone a little...